Wonderful.
All right. Our next question for police reform is going to be, becoming a police officer in Texas requires 2 years of education. Should we have stricter requirements for police officers, or are the current standards sufficient?
Our current position on the state of education required to become a police officer is that the 2 years is more than sufficient in order to qualify you. That does cover an associate's degree, and I would also like to point out that it takes less time, and of course varying, but in each branch of the military it takes less than 2 years to go through your basic training. Our question with regards to whether or not 2 years is sufficient is, would increasing the number of years required turn away otherwise suitable members to join the police force? Let's see. We do agree that the training should improve. There is an article or a study that shows that the years of education along with the training does correlate to the use of force that police officers use during their stops. However, seeing as how both in cases of law enforcement and in military training, that training continues throughout their entire military career. It is never static. We would submit that the training is more important in this case than the number of years required to be of education required to become a police officer. I yield the rest of my time.
Okay, so in terms of police officers and the 2-year degree, you don't have a specific degree that you have to be a police officer. I could major in journalism and get chosen to be a police officer. So 2 years of any degree is definitely not enough. And comparing the military to police is just not true, because military, they have more training than police do. The median police training is about 18 weeks, with only 60 hours for firearm training and 44 for self-defense. When self-defense is unarguably one of the most important things that a police officer needs to know, 44 hours of training for self-defense is not enough, because then we see that these bad police officers are going to use self-defense and hide behind that and say, oh, I killed this person in self-defense. I put my knee on someone's neck for 9 minutes because of self-defense. So yes, training definitely needs to be increased, because when we increase training, we can see that these police officers that are hiding behind things that they might not be trained for that well are they're being held accountable for it. And even Dallas police chiefs are saying that we're asking cops to do too much, and we're asking them to do things that they are not well equipped for, nor are they really trained to do. So training definitely needs to increase. And a 2-year degree in anything that you want to major in is definitely not enough for a police officer. So yeah, I'll just yield the rest of my time.
Do you guys want to do a 30-second rebuttal?
I can. I agree. I think we all agree that the training needs to be better. I, however, disagree that more years of education would solve the problem. What exactly would you be majoring in? What exactly would the education fix that the training wouldn't? I think we all agree that the training would benefit everybody, that in hand-to-hand combat and the like, simulated training, I think that would definitely solve the problem. I think that would come from increased funding and increased time in training. I just don't think that's the education.
Yes. So with more years of education, say they have to get a bachelor's degree instead of an associate's degree, they can major in something that's actually going to benefit them. Psychology, knowing why people do what they do, forensic psychology, any sort of degree that can help them and make sure that they know that they're doing the right things. With a greater education, training will come easy, and those things will be understood better with that education that they have. So 2 years of education is definitely not enough, and if we up that education and do better in the training, we will see that law enforcement will be reformed.
For our last question about police reform, do you believe that police departments in the United States have issues with systemic racism? Are they biased against people of color?
Good evening. George Floyd, Michael Dean, Breonna Taylor. I feel as though the problems that police departments face within the United States are only a consequence of the failure of other systems throughout the United States to effectively combat and solve problems related to race. Undoubtedly, there are problems police departments have with race, but beyond that, the work is done in the courtrooms. From the ACLU, the racial disparities increase with the severity of the sentence imposed. The level of disproportionate representation of Black people among prisoners who are serving life sentences without the possibility of parole is higher than that among parole-eligible prisoners serving life sentences. The disparity is even higher for juvenile offenders sentenced to life without parole, and higher still among prisoners sentenced to life without parole for non-violent offenses. Although Black people constitute only about 13% of the U.S. population as of 2019, Black people constitute 28.3% of all people serving life sentences, 56.4% of those serving life without parole, and 56.1% of those who received life without parole for offenses committed as a juvenile. As of 2014, the ACLU's research shows that 65.4% of prisoners serving life without parole for non-violent offenses are Black. The racial disparities are even worse in some states. In 13 states and the federal system, the percentage of Black people serving life sentences is over 60%. In Georgia and Louisiana, the proportion of Black people serving life without parole sentences is as high as 74 and 73%, respectively. In the federal system, 72% of the 1,230 life without parole prisoners are Black. There are undoubtedly problems and bias against people of color throughout every facet of our system. There shouldn't have to be another George Floyd, another Michael Dean, another Tamir Rice to show that. Black Americans have been underrepresented in Congress. They have earned less than white workers. They have been the victim of racist housing laws, dining laws, education laws, criminal laws, and civil law. We're willing to examine every part of our history and context, except when it comes to our country's treatment of minorities time and time again. And I think the question at this point has moved beyond where systemic racism is in our system to where it isn't. I yield the rest of my time.
Outstanding. Let me adjust this a little. All right. To say that there's systemic racism in United States police force enforcement is downright laughable. It's absolutely hilarious because there's no science or evidence to back it. Let's pull up some real facts. According to Washington Post, if you look at, they keep a database of fatal shootings ever since 2015, and every single year, the highest number was from white Americans. In 2019, 405 white Americans were fatally shot by police. Only 246 were Black. 162 were Hispanic. And 80% of those were in cases where the person was armed. So it's a clear case of self-defense. And with all these cases, you think with all the BLM protests, you see months and months and months, you would think Black people are being hunted down in the streets, but there's no science to prove it. 10 million interactions with police, 10 million arrests. Only 9 unarmed African Americans were shot in 2019. That's a 1 in a million% chance. Now, I admit they do make a large proportion of imprisonments, but according to Pew Research, Black imprisonment is ever since 2006 has been down since Black imprisonment has been down 34% since 2006. Hispanic imprisonment has been down 26% since 2006. We are getting better, and although African Americans make a smaller population, let's not forget that they commit a disproportional amount of crime. So the racial makeup kind of adds up here. You can say, oh, well, white people are a bigger population in America. Well, African Americans commit a disproportionate amount of crime, so it kind of balances out. Yeah.
Yes, I would. I find it funny that we're willing to bring up the fact that supposedly African Americans make up a disproportionate amount of people who commit crimes without any statistics. And I don't know about y'all, I'm not willing to go on things without statistics. And at this point, it hasn't been mentioned. And I'm also not satisfied with the decrease of people in prisons when the system itself is still broken. And it is still disproportionately set up against minorities in things like broken window policing, the war on drugs, etc. Just because things are getting better doesn't mean that they're fixed, and I'm not satisfied with that.
Let's talk about why black people are getting arrested. It's because of decades and decades of failed Democratic policies like Joe Biden's 94 crime bill that arrested a disproportionate amount of black people, or a crooked DA like Kamala Harris, who arrested black youth for nonviolent offenses and also withheld evidence of a man on death row that would have proved him innocent. Democrats have controlled these cities for decades and they haven't done anything, while Republicans, not Republicans, President Trump, mind you, led the effort on common sense criminal justice reform. Yeah.
All right, thank you guys.
All righty, wonderful.
The next subject area that we'll be addressing in this debate is political and racial animosity. The first question is there voter suppression in the U.S. Olympics?
Alrighty. Okay. Outstanding. So, no, there's no voter suppression. Hate to break the news, but no, there's no voter suppression, and there's no evidence to prove there's voter suppression. Let me take you back to a wild time like 2011, when we passed voter ID. The Democrats made a big stink about this. Voter ID would lead to it's voter suppression. It would harm minorities. But according to Vox, and they put out a research by University of Pennsylvania that showed that the original study that made these allegations were a bit flawed, and additional studies proved that voter ID did not deter minority turnout. Now, despite all the election reforms we passed, you would think that we would see large-scale voter suppression. Then why is it that every single year, at least in the past 4 years, voter turnout has increased? In the last year alone, in the 2020 election, we had the highest turnout in Texas ever. Oh, and, President Trump won by more votes, 1 million votes this time in Texas, so the notion that more votes equal more Democrat probability of winning is just debunked now. This is not about curtailing Democratic votes. This is about securing our elections and protecting election integrity, which is what we all want. One vote should equal one vote, and no one should cheat the system to try to win. This is why we need to get rid of things like mail-in ballots. Mail-in ballots are very susceptible to fraud, and if you go back to the debates in 2011, Democrats are on record arguing this. They argued that mail-in ballots are more susceptible to fraud than voter ID. So there is no voter suppression. There's no evidence to prove it. And we should really get rid of those mail-in ballots because there's voter fraud, and we need to solve the fraud problem, not this mysterious voter suppression claim. I yield my time.
I would just like to say I'm glad that we're not really listening to the college Republicans when it comes to what votes should count and what shouldn't, because they challenged the legitimate results of the last election. But let's move on. Is there voter suppression? And to use my opponent's phrase, I find it laughable that this could be debated. 36 states have identification requirements at the polls, 7 of which have strict photo ID laws, of which the U.S. Government Accountability Office concluded reduced voter turnout by 2 to 3 percentage points. In any individual state, this could mean thousands of people lose the ability to vote. 21 million United States citizens do not have any sort of identification for various reasons, but the suppression does not end there. States also block when people can register to vote, like New York, which requires at least 25 days before the election. There's voter purging, felony disenfranchisement, gerrymandering, all of which disproportionately affect minorities. According to a report sent to the UN, such broad statistics mark the racial disparity that pervades the U.S. criminal justice system, and for African Americans in particular. African Americans are more likely than white Americans to be arrested. Once arrested, they are more likely to be convicted, and once convicted, they are more likely to experience lengthy prison sentences. African American adults are 5.9 times as likely to be incarcerated than white people and Hispanics, and Hispanics are 3.1 times as likely. As of 2011, one of every 3 black men born in that year could expect to go to prison in his lifetime, as could one of every 6 Latinos compared to one of every 17 white boys. Racial and ethnic disparities among women are less substantial than among men, but remain prevalent. So let's move on. Of the 277,000 people in prison for nationwide drug offenses, over half are African American or Latino. Nearly half of the 200,006 people serving life and virtual prison sentences are African American, and another 15% are Latino. This comes back to the fact that these systems were established on the fact to purge specifically minorities, no matter how they vote, from voting. Is there voter suppression in the United States? As their cry to detach the election results from who voted makes it clear there is.
Outstanding. I find it very hilarious that Democrats continue to insinuate that minorities, particularly African Americans, are just too stupid to get an ID. We have an ID to get a license to carry. We have an ID to drive. There should be no reason why a voter ID is harmful to minorities. It's very serious. It's very silly. It's ridiculous. It's about election security, and what this is about is allowing Hispanics and illegals to vote, because then they don't know ID.
My rebuttal is going to mainly focus on what I said, because I never said that African Americans were disproportionately affected by voter ID laws. I said that they were disproportionately affected by things like felony disenfranchisement and gerrymandering. Moving beyond that, I find it incredibly ridiculous to insinuate that the prison statistics are being used against illegals. Like, the phrasing and the arguments don't logically add up. This isn't about voter security. They didn't care about voter security until the largest turnout in U.S. history chose Joe Biden to be their president. They didn't care until they started losing.
And the next question is, what do you attribute the recent rise in attacks against Asian Americans to?
Hey everyone. So this is one of the saddest issues going on in our country at the moment. You know, obviously the tragedies of the last few days have struck all of us deeply, and we all should feel for the people that lost their lives in Georgia and in Colorado the other week. I attribute the rise in attacks and hatred against Asian Americans to a variety of factors. The first is historical. We cannot pretend that this issue just jumped out of nowhere and started existing a couple weeks ago. This has been a long-standing issue in the United States. We have anti-Asian discrimination in this country for centuries. I mean, if you look back, there's the Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1880s. There's Executive Order 90116, right, that disenfranchised Japanese Americans and sent them to camps, right, during the Second World War. There are all kinds of discriminations against Asian people in our history, and we have to accept that. The second thing is the rise of the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, this pandemic has affected all of us in deep ways and has shocked the American culture. This has led people to, unfortunately, direct their anger over the virus towards people who have ancestry from the country where it originated. And that is a tragedy, and that is wrong, and that is something that I would hope all of our fellow Americans would stop doing. Our Asian American brothers and sisters had nothing to do with the COVID-19 pandemic, and punishing them for something that happened in a country that many of them are not even originally from and many have not even visited is ridiculous. But to address the elephant in the room, I think that it's a little bit more than just COVID. You know, COVID has stoked anti-Asian immigrants for a while now, but the former president of the United States of America going around smashing on his chest and screaming China virus for 6 months was another deciding factor. You can't imagine a political figure that leads a political party of millions of Americans who already tend to be more white, more rural, the kinds of people that have problems with minorities, and have him shout China virus at them over and over and over and over and over again for the better part of a year for his own political gain, to not stoke anti-Asian sentiments in our country. People hear China virus, China virus, China virus, China virus, China virus, China virus, and they start to think that the virus is associated with people from China. And you know, this has led to tragedy in the recent history of our country, and we have to do things to address it. And the first and most important thing is to end the demography coming from the right. I yield the remainder of my time.
So there's no denying that there is a recent uptake against Asian Americans, especially because it did go up 149%, and while overall other hate crimes dropped 7% in 2020. This needs to be addressed and needs to be looked at, and it's really difficult to find data on this, so we gotta question ourselves and ask, why is it so difficult to find statistics and data on it? And I want to start off by saying that the state of race relations in the United States is abysmal. And there's a reason for that. When you see politicians openly embracing race-based policies and your worth is based on your skin color, it's becoming more and more prominent. When you have the media, higher education, and politicians using division in order to get more votes, to get more views, to get something they want out of it. We have Nancy Pelosi blaming white supremacy for Asian hate crimes, when Democratic leaders were using these horrible acts of violence to point fingers instead of honestly looking at the facts and trying to find a solution for it. Looking at the recent attacks, the perpetrators of said attacks, we can see that the majority of them are not white. Personally, I hate looking at somebody's skin color and determining who they are based on that. I would rather not somebody look at me and say, oh, well, you're Latina, so I know that you're into this, this, and this. But the argument that white people and white supremacy and Trump voters specifically are the reason why Asian Americans are being attacked is kind of disgusting. You're basing one thing on this huge group of people, and according to a 2008 study, the San Francisco police found that in 85% of physical assault crimes, the victims were Asian and the perpetrators were African American. This was 2008 and we weren't talking about it. Why is it that in 2021 we decide to talk about it when suddenly they can use it, Democrats can use it as ammo to attack other people? I yield my time.
You know, I find it a little bit silly for you to ask why we're talking about this now and why we weren't talking about this in 2008, and that there is no data. You know, if you ask the New York Police Department how many crimes there have been against Asian Americans this year as compared to last year, they'll tell you there's a 1,900% increase in the state of New York, in the city of New York City this year because of the China virus, because of Donald Trump and his ridiculous assertion that this is a China virus. By calling it a China virus over and over and over and over and over again, he has stoked this problem.
Blaming a former president on the recent uptakes is kind of ridiculous because viruses have been named after geographic places of origin in the past. There's the flu, there's the Spanish flu, the West Nile virus, the Ebola virus. There's many of different viruses and sicknesses that we often name after the geographic location that it came from. Asian Americans are being treated badly because they have been treated badly in the past, and no one wanted to talk about it until suddenly they can use it as a way to point fingers at the other side.
And the next question is, should intelligence officials who failed to act on information about the planned insurrection be held responsible?
I think potentially, surprisingly enough, this might be a topic where both sides might end up agreeing. However, this question does assume two things. It assumes, number one, that there was actionable intelligence, and number two, that nothing was acted upon. So we can all probably agree that Trump's language can be inflammatory and somewhat insulting to one side, generally speaking. However, this kind of rhetoric is not uncommon. Quote unquote fight rhetoric is not uncommon in American language. It's used on sports teams. It's used in politics all the time. Pressler, there needs to be unrest in the streets. Kamala Harris, protests should not let up. Maxine Waters, if you see somebody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, you get out and you create a crowd and you push back on them. Or Nancy Pelosi, I don't know why there aren't uprisings in the country. Maybe there will be. This kind of rhetoric is common. I'm not saying that what Trump said wasn't potentially responsible. However, it's not uncommon. And there were security guards, there was security that was there for the protests and for the demonstration. Do I think that people or the intelligence officials should be held responsible? Unless there's evidence to suggest that they knew who was going to do it and they actually knew the extent of what was going to happen, I don't think they should be. I yield the rest of my time.
Okay, so I don't really know what was happening there, if we were like trying to say that Trump didn't cause the insurrection, because he openly told people to riot. So I don't know if we're like saying that he wasn't a part of that, because he definitely was. He was telling people to go storm the Capitol because of some faulty election that he really believed in. But let's talk about the security on the Capitol, and let's talk about the double standard that we saw at the riot in the Capitol. Security measures were definitely mediocre and nothing compared to the Black Lives Matter protest in May of 2020. They were able to get in the Capitol. In the Black Lives Matter protest, they sat on the stairs. The National Guard was already deployed before they even got there. They were there in their shields, with tear gas, with riot gear, with assault rifles, already there waiting because they thought it was going to get violent. What happened at that protest? Nothing. There was a megaphone. They were cheering. They wanted peace. They wanted unity. So if we want to talk about the security measures, there was no security. They were pulling on the barricades. They were pulling on the gray barricades, and people were just letting them in. Sure, things may have happened, but it was long after. Tear gas wasn't shot, rubber bullets, all that happened way after and way later than it should have. So there was no security at the Capitol, because if there was proper security, they wouldn't have gotten in the first place. And yeah, we can agree that they should be held accountable, but to say that nobody knew it was going to happen in the first place, or that Trump shouldn't be held accountable for what he said and prompting people to go into the Capitol it's just wrong. I'll yield the rest of my time.
The reason for the upward security, and generally most of the leftist demonstrations, are because of the 6 months of continuous rioting that was done last year in 2020. And with regards to President Trump, he did actively tell people to go home after things got out of hand. To say that Trump was solely responsible is also to say that Nancy Pelosi is responsible for some of the demonstrations that have happened, or Maxine Waters, or Kamala Harris. It just doesn't add up. If you're going to be intellectually consistent, that does not make sense.
Okay, I also think we're getting the difference between a riot and a protest completely confused. People storming the Capitol, that's not a protest, it's a riot. And Trump said that after the National Guard had to get deployed, not from Trump, but from Mike Pence. So he didn't even take the responsibility of trying to protect his people in the Capitol. He just let it happen. And once social media and everyone started vilifying him, then he decided it was time to actually tell these people, stop, go home, we love you. Like, who says that when people are storming the Capitol? You're supposed to protect those people, and instead, you're not.
Alrighty, everybody, we're going to go ahead and move along to everybody's favorite topic, COVID-19. So should Governor Abbott have lifted the statewide mandate on masks and partial business closures when he did? Why or why not?
On March 10th, Governor Abbott lifted the mask mandate. With only 5.7 vaccines distributed at this time, which is roughly less than 5% of Texas, this was way too soon for the governor to release a mask mandate and allow businesses to open up at 100% capacity. Masks have been the only thing that we've been able to minimize this pandemic with. Masks hold in our bodily fluids and stop the spread of COVID-19. When 2 people wear a mask, the transmission possibility of COVID goes down to 1.5%, versus if a healthy person was wearing a mask and the COVID carrier wasn't, it goes up to 70%. Given that you can't tell if you're infected until 5 days is when you test positive for COVID, but you can be infectious in 24 to 48 hours, we see that masks will help us, because even when we don't know that we are infected, we can be, and we can be contagious. But masks are definitely not enough. Along with social distancing guidelines that we need to enforce, we're able to see drastic changes in COVID cases. This is why after holidays or the Super Bowl or spring break, large groups begin to gather without a care of the ongoing pandemic, and we see the numbers going up. Masks do nothing if we don't practice social distancing. It's the same thing like if you're trying to lose weight or something and you're exercising all the time, but you're eating like crap or you're not eating enough, you're not going to see the results without both of them. When we open up businesses 100%, we see that social distancing guidelines and mask mandates are being thrown out of the window, increasing COVID and making matters worse. Starting Monday, every adult in Texas is eligible for a vaccine. And while that might seem good, given that Texas is a red state, we have to look at what that actually means. In Texas, 59% of Republicans either said that they're reluctant to get the vaccine or they just outright won't get the vaccine. So yeah, that might seem like a good thing to hear. Wow, everyone in Texas can get vaccinated starting Monday. But the question is, how many people are really going to get vaccinated? The majority of the state, the red state? No, not 59% of Republicans. They're not going to get vaccinated. So don't let Republicans hide behind the idea that this mask mandate being lifted is a good thing because now the vaccine's available to everyone. Because we have to remember, one, the vaccine was not available for everyone at the time that the mask mandate was lifted. Two, the majority of Republicans in Texas are not going to get the mask or are not going to get the vaccine. And three, COVID cases will only spike further and lives will be lost. Governor Abbott thinks it's time to open up the state 100%. Nice to know that my life is being jeopardized because you guys don't want to wear a piece of fabric over your nose and mouth. I yield the rest of my time.
So never did I think that people would be so up in arms and upset about the government giving us the ability to make our own choices. Because lifting the statewide mandate does not ban us wearing masks. If you wish to wear one, then wear one. If you own a business and you have customers and employees that you want them to wear one, then by all means, have them wear one. Lifting a mask mandate is simply gives small businesses and individuals the ability to choose on whether or not they want to comply. We're wearing them right now. We're all following guidelines right now. We're being safe as it is because we're complying to the University of Houston's enforcement of the rules. So it doesn't keep other people, it doesn't ban other people from wearing it or choosing to want to stay safe. And I'm not going to get into the matter on whether or not somebody's anti-mask or pro-mask. The government shouldn't be opposing these mandates. Mask requirements are an overreach of government power and they're unconstitutional. If you feel unsafe, find a way where you will feel safe, but don't impose your will on other people. Personal responsibility should always be something that should be in the back of our minds. It's not about, we understand that there are many people who have, died from this virus and tragically many people have been lost. That being said, that doesn't give the government the ability to overreach and impose their will on us. The fact of the matter is that we have two groups of people with differing philosophies and views. One boils down to whether or not you believe in personal responsibility, and the other one is whether or not you want the government to impose their will on you. I yield the rest of my time.
Okay, so I'm just going to start off again with, it's not a personal responsibility argument because as I said, there's a 70% transmission possibility. So I might want to be healthy and wear my mask, but if a COVID carrier isn't wearing a mask, then it doesn't matter. There's a 70% transmission possibility. It's not an overreach and it's not unconstitutional. As you can see, she didn't say any reasons or where it violates that because it doesn't. If it was, this wouldn't be happening. But that's just something she wanted to throw out. And personal responsibility, it's just selfish. If you don't want to wear a mask to protect someone, that's selfish.
Okay. So the issue with masks and whether or not you want to wear them. It's not about keeping people safe in some cases. Of course, you can say that, wearing a mask is about keeping people safe, social distancing. However, we see this logic falter when it's simply about compliance. When you're sitting by yourself and there's nobody around you for many yards, they still require you to wear a mask even though it's not causing damage on anybody else. I don't see that same kind of enforcement and rule that everyone should be wearing a mask and everyone should be being safe when people were protesting and rioting.
There's no more rebuttals, right?
All right, moving right along here. Should the United States work towards implementing universal health care?
Yes, sir.
All righty. Outstanding. Absolutely not. We don't need universal health care. Let's talk about the difference between a positive right and a negative right. A negative right is something that prevents other people from doing something. The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are all negative rights. A positive right imposes a duty upon someone else. Universal health care is a positive right, but that doesn't mean it's good. It means it imposes a duty on someone else, and you just can't do that. It's just unfair. Establishing universal health care means doctors get paid less. Medical providers get paid less, so they hire fewer doctors and they hire fewer, or they're able to pay for fewer equipment. It means that you can't have private insurance. If you like your doctor, you can't keep your doctor. You have to be on a government plan, and we all know how government bureaucracy works. That means longer wait times, even if it's an emergency. But people like to say, well, it's the government's duty to protect the public welfare, and that's why we have firefighters, that's why we have cops. Well, we have to be very careful here, because the cops and the firefighters stop an action. They stop someone from imposing on your negative rights, like assault or arson. Let's say that I get into a car accident. I'm flying down a highway and I recognize Ferrari, and my insurance does not cover the cost to fix that vehicle. Should I just not pay the insurance because I can't afford it? Or if I'm in a civil lawsuit and I just can't pay whatever the amount the plaintiff is rewarded, am I just not supposed to pay that just because I can't afford it? Now, if someone is on the verge of death, they should not be rejected and they should not be kicked out of the hospital just because of their insurance. They should be treated. It should not be free. They should still have to pay for it, because no one is entitled to free work, to free duty, and to free will. Everything costs something, and universal health care would fix no problems. It would give a corrupt industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the medical industry is probably one of the corrupt things I could think about. And it would just give them more governmental power. Why on earth would we want to give something that's already corrupt more corrupt power from a corrupt government? It just, it's 1 + 1 = 52. It just doesn't make sense. So we do not need universal health care. Conservatives believe access to health care, whether it be through private insurance or through the employer, that is between the person and the healthcare provider. It should not be, the government should not get a say in it. Now, they can compete, and competition leads to innovation. It leads to innovation in new drugs and medicine. And that's why conservatives believe in free markets, especially in healthcare, because competition leads to innovation and new technology and new vaccines like we just received, thanks to the Trump administration.
I find it incredibly amusing when we're talking about an issue that really affects people in a very direct and economic way, and conservatives bring up things like he started with at the beginning. This issue is really, really simple. How much of your money do you want to spend on health care? In the United States of America, about 17% of our total economy is spent on the healthcare sector every single year. And we have fairly average results in most fields, right? In some fields, we're the best of the best. If you want to have a triple bypass surgery, there's nowhere in the world that's better to be than the United States. But if you want something normal, like a hip replacement, then the United States is a very average place to get health care. But everything is extraordinarily expensive. You, as a taxpayer and as a consumer, spend about 17% of your yearly earnings on healthcare every year. That is extraordinarily high. In the United Kingdom, Australia, Spain, Italy, Germany, France, Japan, and Canada, people spend between 9 and 11% of their income on healthcare. And their results for average surgeries that the average person has in their life are better in a lot of cases than it is here in the United States. Another point that my colleague made was about the corrupt pharmaceutical industry and about how broken it is, and if we give the government power to overrun healthcare, that it's going to get worse. To that, I would simply say that you should try visiting some other countries around the world. People all the time go down to Mexico to buy their medication because it's cheaper there, because they have a government-run system with one negotiator that negotiates their prices and gets a good price because they're buying it for millions of people. While our insurance system has many, 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 many people competing for those prices, and we pay higher prescription prices in the U.S. as a result. Thank you. I yield the rest of my time.
Well, it would be nice if the third largest country in the world could have the same amount of functionality of very small, homogeneous, and very well affluent nations as well. But that's just not reality. You know, different areas of the United States have different needs. And even though the Medicaid, you pay 17% of your taxes go to healthcare, that is one of the highest percentages that our taxes go to. I don't believe in giving them more money for doing mediocre results. I think we should take some of that money and put it to education so we can have more doctors in the industry, especially doctors of underrepresented communities.
Again, this, you know, we can talk about all these different things, but it really comes down to your pocketbook. You, as a taxpayer in America, spend more of your money on healthcare than your peers in other developed nations. Now, yes, there are 330 million people in the United States, and there is no comparable nation on earth that has a similar population and a similar economic profile that we can compare to. But every other developed country in the world does this better than us. It isn't just that Germany does it better. It's Germany, France, Sweden, on and on.
And our last question for COVID-19 is, should the COVID-19 vaccine be mandatory?
Should the COVID-19 vaccine be mandatory is a pretty tough question to tackle in 3 minutes. There are problems with constitutionality, enforcement, and even what it means to be mandatory. Are we discussing schools, businesses, etc.? But I can say this. Every eligible person for the vaccine needs to get it. Don't take my word on that. Take Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. An effective vaccine will protect someone who receives it by lowering the chance of getting COVID-19 if the person encounters the coronavirus. More important is whether the vaccine prevents serious illness, hospitalization, and death. At this time, all three vaccines are highly effective at preventing serious illness, hospitalization, and death from COVID-19. Widespread vaccination means the coronavirus will not infect as many people. This will limit spread through communities and will restrict the virus's opportunity to continue to mutate into new variants. Universities are already beginning to require the vaccine, such as Rutgers, which I do applaud. If we are talking strictly philosophical, then I would say yes, the vaccine should be mandatory, but as I said before, this is a tricky thing to navigate. I would, and as my colleagues would, support any and all measures to make the vaccine mandatory, but at the current moment, it is hard to speculate what this will look like in the current political landscape. I yield the rest of my time.
I think we both agree and disagree on this somewhat. I think more agree than disagree. I think, however, the main difference comes with the government being the deciding factor in whether it is a mandate or not. I think it's completely fine for a college to have a regulation that states that its students need to be vaccinated. We've already got that with the meningitis. If that's something that a private business that wants to do as well, that's completely fine. Our only issue is when it is the government itself dictating that we need to get the vaccine. And I think that's about it, and I yield the rest of my time.
Yeah, we definitely do disagree there. As Lexi said earlier, 60% of Texas Republicans don't want the vaccine. Republicans have stormed the Capitol. They don't trust election results. And I'm not exactly going to be the first person in line to trust these people when it comes to making the right decision to protect our community's welfare. So absolutely, government should step in if these people aren't going to make the right decisions.
Well, that's your answer. He does not trust you to make the correct decision, and that is coming from the party that stated that it was your body and your choice. I yield my time.
Absolutely.
So in this next section, we will be asking some topical questions to the parties. First question, moving forward, should the Texas government maintain the status quo when it comes to its energy sector, or should the government move to regulate the energy sector?
So currently, I don't think that, or our position is that the Texas energy grid is fine being private and less regulated by the government. There are already laws on the books, and before we actually look into putting more regulation in, I think that we should at first look into making sure that they are followed. The grid did fail with regards to the freeze. There's no doubt about that. There's no arguing that. The question being, is government regulation going to fix that? I don't think that is the case. In almost every situation, government involvement ends up slowing things down, ends up reducing efficiency. Prime example is SpaceX compared to NASA. NASA and its itinerary is continuously bombarded by schedule changes because of changing administrations, whereas SpaceX is continuing to make forward progress. Another thing with regards to government regulation in power industries, California is extremely regulated with regards to its energy policies. And they suffer from rolling blackouts due to consistent weather patterns every summer. Those rolling blackouts are also followed by massive forest fires that have been ravaging the area. These are due in no small part to regulations preventing California from being able to modernize their energy grid. And that was stated by Bill Johnson from NRP, stating that they needed more time in order to modernize and and trim trees in order to avoid the forest fires that were ravaging the state. I give my time.
Aren't we a little tired of the government bureaucracy slowing things down a bit? I mean, at this point, how many more times does the free market have to fail the average consumer before we say, hey, surely there's got to be another way to do it, right? Surely we don't have to suffer at the hands of, wealthy producers. But the fact of the matter is, what we are asking right now is what the status quo should look like. Let's think about that for a minute. Let's think about what happened last month. At least 111 people died, mostly people in vulnerable groups like the sick, elderly, and children. Asking if the status quo is fine was like asking midway into Hurricane Harvey if you were fine with what was happening right then. For reference, this winter storm did more damage than Harvey. As the New York Times reports, deaths from the storms had many causes. Most of the victims died as a result of hypothermia, including an 11-year-old boy who froze to death in his family's bed in the Houston area as temperatures dropped. Others died from vehicle accidents, etc., and some of the deaths took place as early as February 11th. Others died as a result of their illness and injuries as recently as March 5th. But honestly, it's kind of frustrating that we're going to sit here and debate regulations or not. Let's think about what we as college students have to go through. We have to navigate a pandemic, a once-in-a-generation winter storm, and on top of that, politicians and senators from the Republican Party who don't care about us. who want to go to Cancun instead of facing problems in their own state. We have to navigate not only all of that, but we also have to navigate an energy crisis, something that everyone here went through, and we're just not going to pretend, we're going to pretend that we didn't? Is the status quo fine? Absolutely not. Are 11-year-old children dying because they don't have energy that they need and we can't get support from other places because we're more focused on our rights? Is that okay? Absolutely not. I value your life more than ERCOT or any energy company's profits. I promise you that.
I agree. The status quo is absolutely not okay. However, I don't see how that status quo would change if the federal government was regulating this more. A week in, an article was published saying that Joe Biden took a low-key approach to his statements regarding Texas. That low-key approach was not even mentioning Texas and the problems that we were going through. If that's the status quo that I can expect from the federal government, then I will not be supporting that. I yield my time.
I can't believe we're talking about the words of the president versus the actions of a Texas senator. We're really going to let him get away with that? We can all vote. Let's think about that. We can all vote. And these people would rather think about the words of the president than the actions of people that directly represent us. Let's think about that when we vote.
The next question is, does the United States benefit from rejoining the Paris Agreement? Why or why not?
Wonderful, wonderful. So I think that the United States has every reason in the world to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. And I'm going to go through some of the major reasons here today. So my friends across the aisle will undoubtedly claim in their response that the Paris Climate Agreement will kill U.S. jobs and hurt the United States economy. I want to say this emphatically. That is not true. The Paris Climate Agreement and green energy policy more broadly will invigorate the United States economy. There are, in the United States, as of 2019, roughly about 1.19 million people that work in the renewable energy sector. That's compared to 3.36 million people that do work in the fossil fuel sector. So there is a bit of a difference there. There are quite a few jobs in the fossil fuel sector. However, if you look at growth over the last few years, you see a massive difference. There have been 207,000 new jobs in the green energy sector in the past year, as opposed to 98,000 new jobs in the fossil fuel sector. So we see that even under the current administration, even during the Trump administration, with all of his anti-environmental policies, we had more job growth in green energy than we did in fossil fuels. Fossil fuels have a lot of jobs that they've created over decades and decades of existence, but the green energy sector has enormous potential to hire more people and to create more employments for Americans. Another incredibly important piece of this is the international aspect of it. The United States is, for lack of a better word, emerging from a period of isolationism. Under President Trump and his many diverse policies that mostly consisted of beating his chest and shouting America first, he has alienated our partners across the world. The United States needs its allies and partners if it's going to deal with a wide variety of issues, from climate change to terrorism to the rise of the People's Republic of China. The United States has to have good relationships with our allies, and spitting on the ground and leaving an agreement that we've all agreed to join, that us, Britain, Germany, France, the UK, Japan, everyone in the world has agreed to join, all of our major allies. To just leave for the idea that we're somehow going to benefit economically when that's not true is ridiculous. It's suicidal in terms of our national security and our foreign policy interests. Leaving the Paris Agreement was a terrible decision, and rejoining it is a great decision. We here in the United States have an obligation to lead the world forward on this incredibly difficult issue that will face generations of Americans going forward. We have to lead now because there won't be time later. And rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement is the first step on that path. I yield the remainder of my time.
So does the United States benefit from rejoining the Paris Agreement or the Paris Accords? No. because it's just a hindrance on American businesses. He already said that's our point of view, and that is, for a good reason, our point of view. My husband personally works in the natural gas sector. I know small businessmen who work in natural gas, who work in these industries. And as soon as Biden was put in, he lost contracts, and he had to fire people, well-meaning people that were just trying to provide for their family during a pandemic, that have lost their jobs. They have downsized in their business. To say that people won't lose their jobs is a blatant lie. Now, I will agree that there will be more jobs that are going to come from different sectors, including that are more eco-friendly. But that can't be something that you need to accelerate. That is something that will happen through innovation naturally. I just want to start off by saying that the U.S. is doing pretty good when it comes to carbon emission, especially when you compare it to places like China. When you look at China, they are the largest emitter of carbon dioxide gas in the world, with a total of 10.06 billion metric tons in 2018 alone. The U.S. emitted half of that. So China is getting it a lot easier from places like the UN. You can see that they're in the Human Rights Council along with Cuba and Venezuela. And the Paris Accords are just a way for nations to pat themselves on the back because it doesn't really accomplish anything substantial. People who study the agreement agree that it lacks teeth. It holds each country to no standard. There is nothing that impedes them from not following what they agreed upon. So if we want to actually see change, it's going to happen naturally through jobs, through innovation, and not through force.
You know, I'm going to start off by agreeing with my colleagues. The Paris Climate Agreement does not go far enough and does not have enough teeth when it comes to really dealing with the climate crisis. We need to go farther as a global society to deal with this global problem. We do need to do more to deal with the People's Republic of China and their gigantic carbon footprint. However, I don't think that leaving the Paris Climate Agreement is in any way going to assist us in that. Leaving the Paris Climate Agreement, leaving the global community standing there when they are offering us something is not a path forward. It's a path backwards.
So yeah, the Paris Agreement is just a lot of nations that are making nice promises with declarations that feel good, and every nation, if they do every single thing that's promised, the temperature will be lowered by 0.09 degrees Fahrenheit in the end of the century. And no, that doesn't really do anything, so why would we be part of something that doesn't really hold any teeth, that doesn't really do anything, when we can let the industry just change and innovate for the betterment and in a better way naturally?
And the last question is, President Biden issued an executive order to halt the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline. Do you support that decision?
Oh, you again? All righty. President Biden canceling the Keystone Pipeline was an absolute tragedy. Imagine you're working at McDonald's or Shake Shack or something, and someone walks in and say, hey, you no longer work here. Go find another job. We just don't need you anymore. That's exactly what Biden did with this executive order. And it's so gut-wrenching to say that people say that, well, these were temporary jobs. They were going to go away anyway. When you sign a contract, you know when that job ends, and it gives you time to prepare and save up and find another job. If someone comes in and abruptly ends that contract, now you're out of income and you're scrambling to find another job. I guess these people that are skilled with their hands in construction can just simply learn the code, I guess, because the Biden administration left them with nothing to look forward to. And let's be real here, we need the Keystone Pipeline. The Keystone Pipeline is a project that will transport oil from Canada to Houston, and Houston is the energy capital of the world. Even Democratic colleagues around here, like Congresswoman Lizzie Fletcher, a Democrat, agreed and urged Biden to support natural gas. Even Democratic Congresswoman Kendra Horn up in Oklahoma said the same thing. getting rid of the Keystone Pipeline, according to a Californian outlet called the Union by all places, admitted that getting rid of the Keystone Pipeline would only lead to increasing emissions. And you want to know why? It's because you have trucks driving up from Canada, down all the way to Houston, and all these minuscule trucks would just emit harmful, dirty gases into the air. If we had a pipeline, it would just go straight down to Houston. They also admitted that it would not lead to an increase in fracking or extracting of natural oils. It would just transport the oil that's already in Canada all the way down here. Let's talk about what this is really about. Now that we don't have oil or energy dependency, which, by the way, even though we weren't in the Paris Accords, the United States still led the world in emission reductions. And this is because conservatives, the new GOP, believes in clean energy like carbon capture technology. But now that we don't have energy dependency, that means we're going to have to go back to places like let's just say the Middle East, or start these forever wars again, because we're not here to protect the people. They're here to extract their oil. I mean, it happened in George Bush, which, by the way, George Bush, terrible Republican. It happened under Barack Obama. It didn't happen under Trump because we were energy dependent, and he did everything he could to help the oil industry because we need oil. I'm sorry, but average Americans driving in cars isn't going to harm the economy. You know, people driving their little Teslas is not going to save the environment. If you want to save the environment, go to China, go to India, because they leave the world in air pollution. Tell them to do their fair share.
Okay, so I'm just going to start with an open contradiction. So first you say trucks are going to harm us and it's going to create more carbon emission because you're going here, you're going there. But then you say electric cars aren't going to do anything and trucks aren't going to harm. So there's a contradiction.
That was mostly a joke.
It's my turn, sorry. Secondly, there's no stats for anything. There was not anything said. It was all just speculation. This will happen, then this will happen. Trucks will harm us, trucks won't. And when we talk about jobs, 1,000 jobs were lost. 1,000 jobs. And they knew it was going to be temporary, 4 to 6 months. That's what they were told in their contract. So it's like when I worked at Walmart in the summer and I was a COVID shopper, and in the 3 months I'm like, wait, what? You're firing me? No, I knew that was going to happen. I knew I had a temporary job. And what he's doing is he's speculating. He's speculating that they're going to work and they're going to plan, and what's going to happen after the temporary job is that they were planning for that. But it's all just speculation. There's no proof with anything that he said. So when we look at the actual numbers, but the fact of the matter is that 11,000 people were employed. And it wasn't like they had this job that was going to secure them forever. It was a job that they knew they were going to lose in 4 to 6 months. And we have to value the environment over all this. So anything that my opponent said about the environment just doesn't work, because he said that trucks aren't going to affect it. But you know what is going to affect the environment? Pollution from fossil fuels. If we don't keep our if we don't limit global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, which is the temperature cap that scientists say, we cannot prevent climate chaos. And we can see that the Keystone Pipeline is actively harming that, and trucks aren't. So it's not a problem. So we do support the decision in halting the construction of the Keystone Pipeline, because we look after our environment and we see that the economic benefits of losing 1,000 jobs don't outweigh any of that. Yield my time.
Well, I'm saddened to hear that those 1,000 people that lost their income, lost their security, I mean, you're just fine with telling them to just sit on the streets and maybe learn to code or find something else to do. Their income doesn't matter. Their security doesn't matter, because we have to save the environment. This false notion that the world is going to end. The scientists have been saying this for decades and decades. Oh, the world is going to end. Oh, it's like Chicken Little. The sky is falling. The world is going to end. And they've been wrong every single time. You know, the scientists have been wrong every single time. So why do we have to risk losing an industry for a fantasy almost?
Thank you. Okay, so I see a common factor between like not listening to scientists and Republicans, because we're not going to listen to scientists when we're saying that our environment is being harmed, and we're not going to listen to scientists with COVID either. But this is literally their job. So just to say that like scientists don't know what they're doing, I don't know why anyone would say that. And again, like, you have no stats for anything, and you're just saying a bunch of speculation. Yeah, 1,000 jobs were lost. You don't seem to care how many lives were killed with COVID or how many jobs were lost then. You don't care about any of that. So to say, yeah, the Republicans are saying that so many jobs are being lost, but one, they were temporary, and two, they were not that many. They knew they were going to lose that job in 4 to 6 months anyways. I yield the rest of my time.
Alrighty, guys. So thanks again to everybody who's watching this live stream. Let us know who you guys think won, and let us know your thoughts on social media. And thank you again to the University of Houston for allowing us to host this debate. And thanks again to the UH Democrat debaters, Blake McNeil, Alexis Arial, and Tyler Garrett, and the college Republican debaters, Natalia Malfitano, Nathaniel Judas, and Timon Hamlet, for coming together and having these conversations with one another. And I hope that this debate will marks the first of many to come, and serves as an important step towards understanding each other's ideologies and ending the polarizing politics of the United States. Have a good night, everybody. And go Cougs.